a 33-year-old man enters a gastroenterology suite, appearing utterly depleted. His breath emits a putrid, foul-smelling halitosis so intense that the surrounding nurses wince and turn away. For 5 days, every dawn has brought violent bouts of vomiting. Yet, what he brings up isn't standard undigested food. It is a clear, thick, mucoid liquid that is, strangely, completely non-acidic. His skin is clammy, he is drenched in a cold sweat, and his abdomen feels as though a heavy stone is pressing down on his vitals. As the physician guides the endoscope into his esophagus, the monitor reveals a haunting landscape. The gastric mucosa, which should be a healthy, vibrant pink, is instead severely swollen, angry red, and oozing blood. This is a classic case of severe acute gastritis. But the most bizarre detail isn't the pathology, it is the satisfied smile on the patient's face. This man didn't fall ill by chance. This is Dr. Barry Marshall, and he did this to himself. Today's story follows the courageous Australian physician Barry Marshall, who famously drank a beaker teeming with Helicobacter pylori bacteria. This daring act was meant to prove, once and for all, that these bacteria, not stress or spicy food, were the true culprits behind peptic ulcers. Following this risky gambit, he cured himself with antibiotics, effectively toppling decades of medical dogma and ushering in a new era of gastroenterology that earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005. What would drive a healthy person to undergo such dangerous, self-inflicted torment? To understand, we must go back to the early 1980s. The medical world was then dominated by an unshakable mantra: no acid, no ulcer. Eminent professors at top-tier medical schools taught that ulcers were a byproduct of modern society caused by type A executive stress, a fast-paced lifestyle, spicy diets, or simply an anxious personality. At the time, the human stomach was considered a sterile wasteland. With a pH between 1 and 2, the gastric environment is acidic enough to dissolve an iron nail. Experts were certain no living organism could survive that caustic sea. Treatment was limited to lifelong antacids or, in more severe cases, a vagotomy, the surgical cutting of the vagus nerve to stop acid production. Millions lived in agony, with a recurrence rate as high as 90%. While countries like Japan saw staggering rates of gastric cancer linked to chronic ulcers and salty diets, the Western world remained fixated on stress. However, young Dr. Barry Marshall and pathologist Robin Warren saw something different. In biopsy samples from hundreds of ulcer patients, they consistently found a mysterious, spiral-shaped blue bacterium. Marshall proposed a radical hypothesis. These bacteria were eating the stomach lining. The medical establishment laughed him off, dismissing the microbes as harmless bystanders. With no animal model able to host the bacteria for testing, Marshall hit a dead end. At 11 a.m. on July 4, 1984, he decided to bypass the bureaucracy. He went to the lab, scraped H. pylori from a patient's culture dish into a cloudy broth containing 1 billion organisms, and without hesitation drank the entire concoction. What happens when you swallow 1 billion live pathogens? For the first 3 days, there was a deafening silence. Marshall went to work as usual, feeling only minor bloating after dinner. He feared the experiment had failed and that his gastric acid had incinerated the invaders. But on the 5th day, the war inside him erupted. Every morning at 6 a.m., he would bolt upright with agonizing stomach cramps, rushing to the bathroom to vomit. His wife, Adrienne, began to complain about a deathly smell on his breath, a putrid odor that even the strongest toothpaste couldn't mask. He was plagued by chronic fatigue, loss of appetite, and pale, clammy skin. Marshall told no one about the bacterial cocktail, suffering in silence because he knew these symptoms were the signal. The microbes were successfully colonizing his body. How do you prove the existence of an invisible enemy with undeniable medical evidence? By day 10, Marshall requested an urgent endoscopy from colleague Ian Hislop. A careful differential diagnosis began. Was it food poisoning? No. Acute food poisoning usually presents with high fever and diarrhea symptoms Marshall lacked. Was it standard GERD, acid reflux? No, reflux doesn't produce non-acidic vomit or that specific deep-seated stench. As the endoscope glided into the stomach, the light revealed a literal battlefield. The once smooth mucosa was severely inflamed and blistered. Biopsy samples were rushed to the pathology lab. Under the microscope, Dr. Ross Glancy applied a Gram stain, and the results shocked everyone in the room. They saw a massive infiltration of polymorphonuclear leukocytes, a state of extreme acute inflammation where thousands of immune cells were flooding the gastric lining. And there, amidst the wreckage of destroyed epithelial cells, were millions of spiral bacteria swimming freely. The daring experiment was an unequivocal success. The key to shattering medical skepticism lay in one historical detail. Just days before drinking the bacteria, Marshall had performed a baseline endoscopy on himself, proving his stomach was perfectly healthy and bacteria-free. This sudden onset of infection, coinciding perfectly with severe gastritis, fulfilled Koch's postulates, the gold standard for proving a causal relationship between a microbe and a disease. The surprising truth is that Marshall didn't actually have an ulcer yet. He had severe acute gastritis. This was the missing link the experts had ignored for decades. His landmark 1985 report in the Medical Journal of Australia detailed how this acute infection was the lethal precursor. Left untreated, these bacteria would silently erode the lining for years, turning chronic inflammation into deep ulcers and, eventually, deadly gastric cancer. That single beaker of dirty water provided the golden key to saving millions of lives. But how does a microscopic organism survive and thrive in the body's most hostile acidic environment? The answer lies in the incredible evolutionary mechanics of H. pylori. Imagine your stomach as a vat of acid. To protect itself, the stomach secretes a protective armor of mucus. When the bacteria enter, they don't swim directly into the acid. Instead, they deploy a biochemical weapon, the urease enzyme. This enzyme converts the urea naturally present in gastric juices into ammonia, which is highly alkaline. This ammonia immediately neutralizes the acid surrounding the bacterium, creating a protective alkaline cloud that functions like an astronaut's pressurized suit on the surface of Mars. Safely inside this bubble, the bacteria use their flexible flagella, rotating like tiny geological drills to pierce through the mucus armor and reach the epithelial surface, where the pH is neutral and safe. Once anchored, they secrete dangerous toxins like CAGA and VECA. Molecular pathogenesis research shows that these toxins break down the tight junctions between stomach cells. The body panics, sending millions of white blood cell soldiers to the site. But because the bacteria are tucked safely beneath the mucus layer, the leukocytes effectively fire blindly, releasing inflammatory chemicals that devastate the stomach's own defenses. It is a tragic case of friendly fire. The combination of bacterial toxins, the breached mucus barrier allowing acid to flood in, and the immune system's own firepower destroys the mucosa. An inflammatory lesion forms, the acid eats away at the open wound, and a peptic ulcer is the inevitable result. How did the light at the end of the tunnel finally appear for the brave doctor? By day 14, the bacterial load began to slightly decline, but the inflammatory damage was rampant. When Adrienne Marshall learned the truth, she was furious. She demanded he take antibiotics immediately or move out, unable to bear the putrid scent of his breath any longer. Marshall complied and began a regimen of potent antibiotics. Within a short time, the bacteria were eradicated, the vomiting and halitosis vanished, and his gastric mucosa healed completely. This journey bore fruit in 2005, 21 years after that fateful drink, when Marshall and Warren stood together in Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize. Their discovery rewrote global medical textbooks. Peptic ulcers were no longer a life sentence requiring surgery or lifelong acid suppressants. They were officially an infectious disease that could be cured in 7 to 14 days. Major organizations, following the 2015 Kyoto Global Consensus, established the combination of proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, and specific antibiotics as the gold standard of care. In Japan, where over half the population was once infected, the Japanese Society of Gastroenterology has used this discovery to miraculously slash gastric cancer mortality rates through national screening and eradication programs since 2013. The legacy of Dr. Barry Marshall is an invaluable lesson. Never blindly trust old dogmas, even when they are defended by the world's leading experts. However, for those without medical training, the most practical lesson is this: never attempt medical experiments on your own body. If you frequently suffer from heartburn, upper abdominal pain, or persistent indigestion, don't assume it's just stress or yesterday's spicy meal. The best course of action is to see a specialist and get tested for Helicobacter pylori according to current medical standards. A simple short course of antibiotics could be the savior that protects your stomach from irreversible damage and prevents the future threat of gastric cancer. Stay healthy, take good care of yourself, and may you find peace and wellness in your journey.